Do I need to share my video? I don't need to do that, right?
I mean, you can. I'm going to be taking my video off after
Okay.
I see it come
I
up
don't
on the
want to share.
screen. Yep.
I don't need to share.
Sure. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I see we have about 78 attendees on the line, and it's 4:07. So we really appreciate everybody's patience for joining tonight's session on the reality of COVID. I will go ahead and I'm your host, Ian Dyer. I'll be facilitating and producing behind the scenes, monitoring the questions that come in. If you don't see anything come up on your end, it's the design of Teams Live to permit the producer, me, the ability to publish anything. And while there isn't a typical comments chat box, please feel free to use the Q&A and submit anything. I won't go posting anything that seems as though it's off color or anything like that, but that will be the best modality. Q&A chat is the best way and really the only way to provide any questions to your presenters this evening. Because of the volume that we're expecting, in order to keep things under control, Teams Live does not allow for the presenters to interact directly based upon sound, and you can imagine the bandwidth issues and so forth with those attendees. So without any further ado, I will go ahead and hand it over to Diane St. Dennis with the Red Cross, and I will post the slide deck for you. Diane?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Just a couple of things that I wanted to let you know. We are offering continuing education contact hours through the California Board of Registered Nursing. Unfortunately, we still haven't worked out a way to get continuing education hours for pre-hospital personnel, but we continue to work at that on that at the division level. However, if you are a nurse, if you're an RN, an LVN, or an LPN, and would like continuing education hours, please in the chat, or well, Q&A is the only place I guess you have to do it. What we need from you is your name, your email address, your license number, and in which state you're in. And we have some people that are going to go ahead and issue your continuing education certificates, and that may take a week or so because we have quite a few people on, but you will receive it in your email. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mara Aspinall, and Mara is from Arizona, and she is the director of a lab, and she and Cheryl did this presentation for the swarm division, and it was so fascinating. This is all facts. This is not internet stuff. This is the real deal about the numbers and the types of testing and the ethics that we have to deal with. So I'm going to let Mara go ahead and introduce herself a little bit further, and we can go ahead and get started. Mara, go ahead.
Super, thank you, Diane. And if you could put it in presentation mode, that would be terrific.
Slideshow from beginning.
Yes. Well, as I do that, I'll just give a little bit of introduction as Diane is doing that. I'm going to speak about the overview and in particular focus on testing. And Cheryl Schmidt will then talk about the ethical issues, and then we will both take questions. Next slide. That's me, and I'm going to talk about testing, the key to recovery. Next slide. Sorry, there seems to be a delay. I'm going to start by talking about the basics. You can click twice more going forward. The difference between the virus and the disease. And it's important to recognize that you've probably heard the virus is SARS-CoV-2, severe acute respiratory syndrome. You can click again, Diane. Coronavirus 2. And when people ask about what is coronavirus, you probably know it has nothing to do with the beer. It is that black and white photo on the left, one of the very first photos with an electron microscope in 1965. And it looked like a crown to the first people who saw that. And the Latin word for crown is corona. And that differs from the virus, from the disease itself, which is COVID-19. It was coined on December 31st, 2019, and what you see here is the lungs of a 77-year-old man and how the lungs are clear day 5, beginning to see infiltrate day 15, and significant cloudiness of disease by day 20, and unfortunately, he died on day 30. Click. Next slide. So what is the devastating effect of the disease? You all know this because you see it in the news. And what you'll see here in a minute is 4.5 million people in the US alone, more than 150,000. I think what is most devastating about this is the fact that it took us 2 months to get to 1 million, then 6 weeks, and then less than a month to get an additional 1 million cases. Worldwide, last week, Diane, you can click again, so we'll get to the next one, is that it took only 4 days worldwide to add 1 million cases. So unfortunately, our second surge, or in many ways, when you look at this, the first surge is good. It's beginning to level off. But certainly the days in May that we had hoped that this might go away over the summer is no longer the case. One of the questions that I get a lot is, how does COVID-19 compare to the flu? And people at the beginning saying, isn't this just a really tough flu season? Well, I wanted to, as we talked about, give you some facts and compare it to the flu. And what I took is, if I looked at the last 20 years, the worst flu season, which was 2017, 2018. And in that flu season, there were roughly 45 million people with the flu. There's about a 10% over and under that. And that's in blue. And I'm going to compare it to the reported numbers, that 4.5 million of people who have gotten positive tests for COVID. But the idea is there may be as many as 14 million additional people who are asymptomatic, and that's the yellow. So first, let's look at hospitalizations. About 300 million people hospitalized for COVID. In flu, actually about 800 million people are hospitalized. But what is different, and just in the last 2 weeks did this cross over, the total number of hospital days has increased for COVID. It's more than flu. The average flu length of stay is somewhere between 3 and 5 days. The COVID length of stay, interestingly, has reduced. It used to be on average 20 days. Now it's on average 12 days, which is great news, although more younger people are getting it. So the number of total hospital days is higher in COVID, but more people to date have been hospitalized for the flu. But the real difference comes in deaths. About 150,000 have died so far with COVID. I'd love to believe it's over. I think that we will, like other pandemics, will be dealing with this for at least another year. Where in the worst flu season we've had in 20 years, there were 61,000 people died. So if you look at the death rate, if you only include people who were diagnosed formally with COVID-19. It's 29 times the flu. And Diane, you can go to the next slide. But if you look at people who presumptively have it, it's 5 times the death rate. So I think it's important to say the flu death rate is about 0.1%, and COVID-19 is somewhere between just under 1% and 4%. I suspect the death rate will go down, but the total number of people who die will certainly go up. The key there is this next slide on the age adjusting for COVID. So if you look at cases per million, you see that there are many more cases per million in the 85 and above, because if they're exposed at all, they get sick, and then it goes all the way down to 19. This was done about a month ago. What has changed is the number of young people getting the disease has increased, and that's why the death rate has decreased. You can go to the next slide. And so it's important to note that the most risk, the people who are most vulnerable amongst us, there's more precautions, and thankfully they are getting the disease less frequently, but certainly some of them are still getting it. So we then look to testing to say, okay, this is where the disease occurs. How is the testing working? And what you see here is testing since the very beginning of the pandemic. On the first day, we did 25 tests. We're now doing over 800,000 tests after a lot of debate and a lot of focus. Thank goodness we're now at a much higher number, and 7-day average just over 800,000. And roughly, we had hoped that the positive rate would go below 5%. It was for a short period of time, but the positive rate is now nationwide. Last 7 days, 8%, not very different from the pandemic average of 7.3%. And you can see that graphically. Diane, next slide. In the chart below, the orange are the people who are negative, and the blue are the people who are positive. But if you look at a state like Arizona, during our worst of the pandemic only 2 weeks ago, we were having 25%, similar to Florida, very, very high numbers of people who were getting the tests were positive. But how does that rank? Is 800,000 tests a day good, bad? Well, in a number of studies, this gives you a sense of it. On the bottom, it looks like the current testing, which is 800,000 a day. To begin to mitigate is probably close to 1 million, 1.2 million a day. So another substantive increase of 40%. But to truly hit suppression or the equivalent of herd immunity, we need 4 million a day, or as the Rockefeller report called for, 30 million a week. Cheryl, you can go to the next slide. Diane, you can go to the next slide. That is very important to understand. Now, why is that? It appears, and many people didn't understand this at the beginning, that people who are asymptomatic may still have, or do still have, a very high viral load. And these super spreaders are not necessarily the people who are sick. The most recent data would say the super spreaders are people who have zero, and I really mean zero, symptoms. They don't have a fever, which only happens about 32% of the time, and our baseline population has a fever is about 12%. So fever is not a good indicator, but these people don't even have a headache. They have no idea they have the disease. So when we look at this, I showed you those numbers for the US, but as everybody recognizes, the US is not a monolith. So we have to look at testing per state. The US average is 161 per 1,000, but you can see states like Alaska, New York, Louisiana, DC, New Mexico are amongst the highest at well over 200 per 1,000. Cheryl, go to Diane, excuse me, next slide. But other states are still significantly below that. And some of the states are states without large outbreaks like Hawaii, but some of the states have had large outbreaks and they are still very low in testing. So this is one way to look at it, from the highest testing states to the lowest testing states. The next slide, perfect, is looking at this from the largest states to the smallest states. And the width of a bar is their population. So California and Texas are the largest populations, and their testing, California is above average, Texas is below average. Next slide. So that gives you a sense of testing from the beginning of this pandemic. And the reality is everybody wants tests. Next slide. You can see in headline after headline that's the case. So let's talk about the tests. My firm has put together a database of tests which are now available. And I don't know, Ian, if I can give you this in the chat, but it's Testing Commons, COMMONS.com. And you can get this database and you can interact with it. Nope, go back one slide if possible. But you can see there are almost 1,500 tests. About half of them are looking for the virus. Half of them are looking, don't bother, Diane, just leave it. Half of them are looking for the antibody. The tests are made from all over the world. About a third or so are from the US. The rest are from Asia, Europe, and there are few now in Africa. The tests that the US have are sourced from components from all over the world, and the same with Asia. You can go to the next slide now. Thank you. And what you'll see here is how the FDA has dealt with so many tests. They started out saying business as usual, and we're not changing anything. They were amongst the last government agency that declared a health emergency. They declared it about a couple of weeks after other agencies had declared it. We then had 10 weeks of unprecedented relaxation. States were able to approve tests, and you could have a test, put it out on the market before you even went through any clinical trials or even talked about clinical trials. Happily, the FDA said, no, that doesn't work. After 8 weeks, they have what I call cautious retrenchment. They stepped back and they said, we need to see your clinical trials. You need to do trials with at least 30 positive and 30 negative. I won't go through all the details, but now there is a process to get tests approved, which I think will increase quality for all of us. Next slide. But with all these tests, everyone talks about how do we deal with this? How do we deal with all these tests? Does it really make a difference? And all of you know the Red Cross, know the basics. So I will go, Diane, 2 slides ahead and talk about the different kinds of tests.
Just real quickly.
Yep.
Just letting you know with the lag, I believe you're essentially reporting real time. There's just a bit of a lag, so people are mentioning that you're ahead of some of the details that they're able to see on the slide deck. Just a point of information. And you're doing great on time.
Okay, I thought I was ahead. I didn't realize it was that much ahead. Okay, Ian, keep telling me this so I make sure that it's consistent. So what you should see, nope, go ahead. What you should see is a slide in a minute that says 2 different questions require 2 very different tests. Ian, do you see that now?
It is not on the live feed just yet, but it should be there any second.
Okay, so I'm seeing the same live feed. Okay.
Yep.
And Diane, if you click twice more, what you should see, and remember that there are 2 different questions. What are those questions? The first one is, do I have COVID-19? And the second one is, do I have antibodies to SARS-CoV-2? And you remember we talked about them at the beginning is different. The red is always going to be what is called active virus testing. The question, okay, stay like that, Diane, for a minute. And the questions are on the red, is the virus present? There are 3 ways to find this. and they're roughly in chronological order. When the disease was first noticed, we were only diagnosing people through lung X-ray and lung CT. We then started looking for the viral RNA or DNA of the virus. We then started looking for the antigens, which is kind of showing that your body is starting to fight back. So with that, that's the active virus test, and that's in red. On the other side are the antibody tests. And everybody thinks about this as the end of the disease. You know, did I have the disease? It is somewhat useful there, but it's also useful, critically useful, while somebody's in the hospital to see, are you finding that the body is fighting back? And everybody knows this. You know, you have a cut on your finger. Diane, you can click 2 more clicks. You have a cut on your finger and you need the white blood cells to help heal it in the same way. And I'm going to show you a chart. We need to fight off this virus in our bodies. So on the left side, on the red, what is the most important thing about the test for the virus is that there are no false negatives. Perfect. Go back. One. We want to never miss a case. And that's really important. So we don't want to tell anyone that they don't have the virus and they do. On the green, on the right, I know it's not there yet, that we want no false positives. We don't want to call somebody immune and then they're not. And that's what's called specificity. What's important here is the no false negatives versus no false positives. Diane, you can click now because it'll take a minute to get there. What's important here is that I put immune in quotes because we don't know whether people are truly immune. Diane, you can, what we want to do is see the red and green line. There's been a lot of data put out now because the disease is only 7 months old. We're trying to see if people who had it in January do they still have antibodies? And are they going to be immune? And thank you, Diane. What you see here is the fact that antibodies change over time. So on day 1 on the left, remember the virus is in red. What you'll see is 100% of people have the virus. But by the end of 3 weeks, still 1/3 of people are going to test positive for the virus. Now, are they infectious? We don't think so. There's more tests to be done there, but we don't think they're infectious. But contrast that to the green, which is always antibodies. On day 1, some people already have antibodies fighting that virus. Most people get sicker and the antibodies go away and then they come back and then they go away and they come back and they go away. For most people, but certainly not everybody, it crosses at day 12. And at day 12, as it crosses, that is the point for most people. You can leave that, Diane, that's great, that it makes a difference. And what you see here is that by the end, 90% of people have antibodies. But I'll tell you the story of my family. I've had 7 of my close family sick, 22 of my friends, and with 1 death. And my closest cousin, he was sick for 41 days, and he had 7 tests before he got 2 tests in a row that were negative. It's important to recognize this because the virus kind of hides. And early on, some of these people are early on. It's important to note. So if you see here, what you'll see is that this patient at the top had positive tests, then a negative test, and then a positive test. So that's why people are super cautious, even if you can't get a second test, to make sure there's at least 2 weeks. And now people are saying 3 weeks without any symptoms. Next slide. Not sure what the next slide is going to be. Okay, I'm not sure what the next slide's going to be because this was the slightly older version. Sorry about this. Well, what I'll talk about is the need for good sample taking. And it's important to note there are lots of different ways to take samples. Most of you are familiar with this, and what you could see here in these slides are how it works. Cheryl, Diane, you could click through this. Sorry, guys. I think it's 2 or 3 more clicks. I didn't realize that there would be such a delay. What this shows is the different technologies and how they work. On the left, again, in red, most of the active virus tests, which are called PCR, are done in a central lab. That's why it takes a long time. The average in Arizona of late has been between 7 and 9 days. The average, just leave it, that's okay. The average around the country is 7 days. And I'm going to talk later about why that's so important, because people are most infectious or they have symptoms. Now, they could get symptoms and they're definitely infectious then, but even if they don't get symptoms, they're most infectious at day 3, 4, 5, and 6 after they're exposed. And what you also see at the bottom here is that for those antibody tests, you can look at the bottom and see that some of them are finger stick. You can go on to the next slide. This is a presentation with a lot of photos, so it's a little, takes a little while to do this. When we do questions, we won't have the slides up, so it should be a little bit easier. When you see the pictures of the sampling techniques, you will see that there are pros and cons to each of them. And I won't go through these in detail because I've talked about most of them, but on the left in red, these tests are supposedly non-invasive, but they're quite difficult. They're very sensitive. They'll see only 100 copies, and sick patients could have 300,000 copies, but it's hard to do right. The blood tests are easier because we know how to take blood either from the arm or for a finger stick. The problem is those tests are not very accurate. So most public health people now are saying it's not worth having antibody tests because there are so many challenges with those tests today. I do think they'll get better as we go forward. Next slide. And as I talked about, the value of immunity, particularly based on these antibodies, is not clear. What's also interesting, we're finding there are we know there are 2 different types of immunity. So it may be that you need antibodies, but you also need memory T cells to be truly immune. And we don't know how those are going to work yet. And it doesn't look as if people have more immunity if they were sicker or less or older. It seems today random, but we don't know. This next slide, Diane, this is a picture of those, what's called anterior nasal swabs that go all the way back. The good news is, I hope it's going to be on the next slide, you will see the fact that we can be taking samples from all over the body, the front of the nose, saliva, certainly the lungs works, but that's a very invasive system. So what we do is we're trying to focus, one more click, on the front of the nose. The problem is these tests aren't very accurate. It's not that the tests are wrong. It's just that if they're not sampling it in the right place, you're not going to see the virus. And you can click again to get to the next slide, which is why many companies started to do saliva testing. You can go to the next one, and to see how saliva works. And the study I'm going to show here was from April, showing that saliva worked as well as nasal swabs. But just today, there was another study published that said saliva doesn't work as well as nasal swabs. So the reality in the early parts of a disease, we're still learning. And I'm sure, as everybody remembers with HIV, yeah, Diane, just leave it there. With HIV, we didn't know. We thought it was contagious by touching somebody. We found out that wasn't the case. In COVID, we thought it was contagious in touching. It probably still is, but it does not stay long on hard objects, but does stay longer time in the air. So it's important to recognize that as much as we'd like all the answers, we have to be guided by science because we don't have them all. So as I conclude here, just a few more slides to talk about new testing technologies. Number one, it's important to recognize these do-it-yourself tests. I believe they will be available in Q4 of this year and broadly available next year. That will all, I wish I could show it to you, but if you've seen a home pregnancy test or a home HIV test or a home hepatitis test, they will look just like that. You can see it on the screen. Oops. Well, it was on the screen, and it's a test where you stick it in your mouth. You get cells from your mouth. You then stick it in a little vial, and it changes color to say whether it's positive or negative. I believe these tests will be available less than $10, maybe less than $5. And ultimately, I hope sometime in 2021, they will be there. And there will also be fingerstick tests for antibodies and broad tests. You can go to the next slide. But right now, no tests have been approved. The FDA has actually pulled 4 tests that were home tests because they didn't work. If you're thinking, well, wait a second, I read an article about a home test by Rutgers. That is not a home test now, it's a home collection. So there are a number of companies that you can spit into a tube, you can scrape your mouth, you can scrape your nose. Leave it like that for now, the slide. But those tests are only home collection, and then you put it in FedEx and you get your answer between 3 and 7 days later. You're not completely at home. Next, new technology, and I'm going to be finishing soon, are the wastewater analysis. And this is what I otherwise call poop pooling. And what you can see here in Tempe, Arizona is the first 4 bars are during a lockdown when there is no COVID-19 in the sewage. And then on a log scale, if you look at the next 4 weeks, just actually it's 4 days after opening, we start seeing COVID-19 in the sewage, and then more and more and more over this period of time. Next slide. So why is this important? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I want to be able to get to Cheryl and questions, but what you'll see is it's important to understand the severity of disease because while we can't do it directly through tests, I think eventually we will, and you'll see on the next slide that there are 6 different types of COVID-19. Again, a good example of learning because only a month ago we didn't have enough data to be clear about what are the different types. So I'm not going to go through them, but you can read them. The first 3 are less severe than the last 3, and older people tend to get the last 3, but not all. I think it's more important to realize that people who get 4, 5, and 6 are more likely to die, whether they're young or old, and people who get 1, 2, 3 are less likely. Next slide. What this slide shows is that it is very important to understand the data around what I said on why it's important to get tests back quickly. And what you'll see is the fact that 63% of your infectivity happens in the first week after being exposed. So you see here on the red and orange, that's when you're most infectious. If you're going to get symptoms, you tend to get them between day 5 and 6. And the problem is you're walking around. I'm walking around and I feel completely, perfectly fine. But 30% of my time being infective is happening at the beginning. And then the rest of the infectivity happens afterwards. And what you can see on the right is that if we tested everybody every day, we would catch 99% of the cases. But that's not going to happen. So what this paper recommends is we test everybody, or at least people in high-risk situations in schools, nursing homes, congregate housing. If we test everybody once a week, we could isolate the infectious, and next slide, we could reduce the burden essentially like herd immunity by about 60 to 70%. So I'm going to conclude here to say what I believe should happen in the future and what I believe will happen. What should happen in the future are 5 things. You'll see them on the, you could just skip this slide, just shows the average turnaround time. The 5 things that should happen in the future are the fact that we should increase testing to about 30 million a week, and that will make the difference that we're talking about. Number 2 is we need to do contact tracing, and again, why it's really important to get tests back quickly, because I don't know about you, but well, I haven't left the house in 6 weeks, but no, 9 weeks. But if I had, I wouldn't remember who I spoke to 9 days ago. So we need to contact trace quickly. We need to vertical quarantine, get us all out of the house, and only the vulnerable and infectious. We need to have treatment protocols shared broadly so the rest of us are not scared. If you get sick, you feel more confident we know how to treat it. That's getting better. And then lastly, we will have a next surge and we will have another epidemic. We've had 4 epidemics in the last 100 years. COVID-19, depending on what you count it as AIDS, has been and will continue to be, I would say, the worst of those, particularly in the U.S., where the last few epidemics, both 1918, which killed more people than, I hope, than COVID-19 will be, but in the 57-58 flu, it killed, next slide, you can leave it like that, more people in the U.S., and it takes 2 years to reduce. In 57, 58, and 1918 and 1919, the second year was far more deadly than the first year. So I hope I'm wrong about all of those. What will happen in the future, this is my last slide, there will be additional surges. Companies will be focused on contact tracing. The vaccine, I hope, will happen, but it will not make an impact till 2021. Test quality will improve, home sampling will be around, and we'll need to, in the fall, next slide, test for multiple viruses, not just COVID-19. We're going to have to test for the flu. Thank you all. Sorry that was a little awkward and took a little time because of the lag. So now I'll hand it over to Cheryl. And Cheryl is ASU College of Nursing and Network Advisor for Red Cross. And that's me in my mask.
Thank you. You can go ahead to the next slide, Diane. Next slide. The next slide you'll see is just a visual. My colleague Mara had talked about the different types of pandemics we've had in the past, and this is just an interesting source, came out of the Discover magazine back in June, showing you the size of the number of people killed in various epidemics going all the way back to the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages. And you can see way down on the bottom row there how COVID at that time, this was only June, how small it was compared to some of the other pandemics. Next slide. I don't know how many of you have studied ethical principles. If you're nurses, you probably had this in one of your courses. We talk about beneficence or being good to people, non-maleficence being non-harmful or not hurting people, autonomy, allowing clients to make their own choices, justice, being fair to everyone, try to distribute treatment and vaccines and care, and distributive justice is a public health term we think about when there aren't enough resources, you give them to the ones with the greatest need and the least ability to take care of themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about vaccines. Next slide. I'll go ahead in the interest of time. don't know if that's the right one here. Let's see. Okay, yeah, it is. Is the cure worse than the disease? If you've been reading the paper, watching the news, depending on what channel you watch, there's no prior history of closing down the economy during our previous epidemics or even pandemics. Those who've been hurt most during the economic disruption in this current shutdown are low-skilled, low-income workers, other vulnerable populations. The money given to many who lost their jobs when businesses closed is more than they make when working, causing some to prefer to stay on unemployment. You've been hearing that recently as they talk about whether they should give them less, like 70% of what they used to get paid so that they would be motivated to go back to work. The problem might be there won't be enough small businesses reopening during the shutdown to restore the economy. So we're very concerned about the future. Next slide. I'll talk about vaccines. There are several vaccines in production all over the world. One of the most quickly developed is the one with Moderna, and they're actually doing testing here in Arizona, and they're actually trying to recruit 30,000 people for each of the different vaccines to include their phase 3 trials. But who's going to get it initially? There was an article recently that the International Council of Nurses this past Monday said if there is a vaccine, it should be given to healthcare providers and first responders initially so that we can take care of other people. Others argue that it should be given to those most vulnerable, like the greatest risk with the least resources. Who's going to decide who those people are? Some of the high-risk groups that we hear about are the elderly, Native Americans, African Americans, and of course our healthcare providers and first responders. We know initially that nursing homes have received less personal protective equipment, despite the fact that they've had the highest per capita death rate. That it's getting better. We've had more support of our nursing homes, but we're concerned that if the vaccine comes out, who's going to get it? Well, we have the same problem with fair distribution. So as a healthcare provider, you need to ask, what is my ethical duty to care for patients if there's not enough PPE? If you are at risk yourself based on age, or you may have a family member you're caring for, or just worried about going in, and there's not enough personal protective equipment in your workplace, should you go in, or you should say, I don't want to die, I want to stay home? Should you continue to care if you don't have any PPE? That's a personal choice, but we might need to do some regulations of who really should be going in and who shouldn't be risking themselves. Should your patients outweigh your family's risk? That's a personal decision again. And if you believe you're going to spread COVID to your family, patients, and colleagues, is that an ethical decision that you make? Say, I'm going to go ahead and work, I don't care, I'm going to take care of my patients, but then what if you bring that disease back to your families? So there are a lot of mixes of feelings here and whose ethics outweigh others. Next slide. This is just a harm reduction benefit promotion. These are some of the ethical frameworks that the Public Health Emergency Preparedness and Response System has created, where they want to reduce harm and benefit more people. So you protect public safety, health, and well-being, minimize death, injury, disease, disability, and suffering. Distributive justice is where you conduct activities to make sure that benefits and burdens are shared equitably and fairly. Who should get that care and those resources first? Community resiliency and empowerment. We need to make sure our communities, including our healthcare systems, our nursing homes, our schools, our public health departments, have long-term goals of developing community resources. And we've talked about this since September 11th, for instance. We had wonderful survival equipment. We had their public health supplies, and they kind of disappeared. And that's why when this pandemic hit, we started having a shortage of resources. And we need responsible civic response. We need to get our public members, our people in our communities, our public leaders, and make them feel personally responsible, but also caring for the rest of the public. And I believe that's the last slide of my presentation, so I wanted to make sure we had enough time for questions. I think there might be one more slide if you wanted to put that up. So now I guess we're ready to open it for questions for either Mara or myself, and I believe Ian is going to be announcing those questions.
Thank you both very much. Yeah, the chat box is open. We've seen a couple of questions come in, and I shared a couple of websites that the participants shared in the Q&A also with respect to the ncov2019.live as a site. Testingcommons.com was mentioned. I believe it was Mara that shared it earlier. The slides, inquiry on whether they will be available to share with the group.
I'm willing to share, and I'm sure Mara is. I don't know how you would get that out to people. Is that something you put on your website or in the connection?
Yeah.
Volunteer
and
connection.
I'll put together a PDF so it's easier to read with the slides.
Good. Okay.
Cheryl, actually, if you want, I'll just put it together in one if you're okay with that.
That's fine. That's perfectly fine. Sure.
And we'll add the nice slide with you with your mask on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And for those who haven't heard, tomorrow is a national wear a mask day. All the nurses and nursing students all over the country are supposed to post a picture of themselves on Facebook wearing a mask. So Mara and I had pictures. Mara's in the presentation. Mine was sent late, so it's not up here.
So the another question, this is being recorded, so I'll make sure that once this gets compressed, I will share that with the presenters and they can push it out in the same manner. Inquiry on, for testing purposes, how soon after exposure is the virus detectable? I don't know if that was answered on a slide. It was a question about 8 minutes ago.
No, it's an important question. I'll take it briefly. Virtually 100% of the time, day 3 is the first day that it can be detected. Nothing is 100%, but what we're finding when we do the contact tracing is it takes 2 days or 48 hours for the virus to basically settle into the body. And before that, even if it's going to come out at day 3, you can't detect it with any test.
Okay, and I think Diane may be trying to get to the slide for the inquiry. Please re-show the slide listing the symptoms of COVID-19.
And I can, well, it'll be there in the future. This
Okay.
is and I'm sorry, Cheryl, this was the older version.
No worries. I think it's above that. I think it's slide 27.
Yeah, exactly.
Slide it back up to
And
27, Diane.
This came into the British, this was done in the British Medical Journal just this week. And 3
27.
serious and 3 not so serious.
All right, another question, how do we obtain CME confirmation?
Okay, if you can put your name, your email address, your license number, and your state into the chat, we will take care of that, and we will email your certificate to you.
And right now, I only have about 20 people who have done that so far. Is there an email you would like to have people or a site that might be preferred once this chat box closes? I'll keep it open for about 10 minutes afterward. But if we miss anybody, should they reach out to one of you?
Ian, are you asking that for Cheryl and me?
Just anybody.
Why don't you send
Diane,
it to me, because, yeah, send it to me. Ian, if you could put my email address in the chat box, and any of the nurses, if you don't get your information in there, I can forward it to the people that are going to assign the continuing education certificates.
Diane, maybe you could add a slide at the very end with that information in it.
You don't have a number at the end of your email, do you, Diane?
Pardon me?
It's just Diane.St. Dennis, correct? Or is
St.
there a
Dennis.
number?
Yeah. No number. I'm an original.
Love it. I'll put mine just in case too. Looks like we're getting a few more now.
I actually can see them now, Ian.
Okay, good. Good.
And let me also mention while you're looking for another question, the World Economic Forum and Arizona State University are doing a survey of employers, and that's at asucovidcommons.com. If you can type that out, Ian. And if you'd like to take the survey, if you have any size business from one, if you know people with businesses from 1 employee to 10,000 employees, it's we're trying to get 10,000 businesses around the world, and you'll have access. Well, actually, anybody will have access, but you'll have special access to a dashboard at ASU where you'll be able to say, what are restaurants in Chicago doing? Are they testing? What are furniture manufacturers in France doing? What % of companies are testing? And you'll be able to do that all by yourself, but we want to get people to fill out the survey.
And what was that website one more time?
Actually, I might be able to put it down. It's asucovidcommons.com. And if anyone has any problems with that, that was from me, Mara, let me know.
ASUCovidcommons.com, all one word?
Yep.
Okay. Jumping back into the questions, and a lot of people are getting their details in, so that's occupying most of the Q&A query.
Oh, Cheryl, there's one comment about dogs sniffing out COVID. I actually think it does work, but not reliably enough, so I don't think that's going to be a good diagnostic. And
Probably
Cheryl,
not.
a question about COVID-related increases in depression and anxiety.
That's definitely been noticed, and they're concerned because people, especially if they're sheltering in place, they're not going out, they're not doing their usual activities, they're seeing higher suicide rates and depression. So we need to be worried about that. And they're seeing it more in children, too, that aren't back to school. That's one of the arguments for getting them back into a protected school environment.
Looks like there may have been a couple of others. There's one on how accurate are total case numbers when the sick individuals are tested multiple times until they show negative. You may see that one.
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is probably directionally right, in the sense that you're right that many people, hospitalized people, are tested multiple times. On the other hand, there are tests that are not being recorded, and there are certainly people who, certainly people who have the disease or not. Some states, about half of the states, maybe more, are keeping their statistics per person, not per test, and they're the larger states. So we think that it's reasonably accurate, but it's directionally accurate, even if it's not precisely accurate.
I heard there was one state that was only reporting positive cases, so they said they had 100% positive rate.
Yeah, I believe that's been corrected since then, but that's right.
Good.
And and when you look at some of the charts, you'll see blips, and that's because those sort of things are corrected. But you're right. And then at the beginning, when antibody tests started, states were combining them and not talking about the difference between antibody tests and diagnostic tests, as you know, the red. the active virus, and that's been corrected, I believe, now in 100% of states.
Another question, how often should healthcare professionals be tested even when working with full PPE?
Cheryl, what do you think?
I know here at ASU they're recommending every 2 weeks, but again, we have very fast turnaround. We're now doing the saliva testing, and I get my results in 24 hours. But some very essential employees, like utility companies, they're telling them every week. So it sort of depends on where you're working and what the exposures might be.
Yeah, the Rockefeller report on surveillance testing saying if you interact with a lot of people, it should be weekly.
Yeah.
If you're working at home, you certainly do not need weekly testing.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Any ideas on how we can narrow the testing and tracking window?
Well, I mean, it's a very big question, but the short answer is I think it's going to be very hard with PCR testing, those red tests, the active viral tests. We're at 5 times the load that our system was ever set up to do, so I don't think it's going to help because the tests keep coming in. I think it's got to be with ultimately home tests. And if you get your result, like Cheryl talked about at ASU, in 2 days, you can remember what you did 2 days ago. You can't remember what you did 9 days ago. And even if you did, you've already spread it.
Mm-hmm.
I know more labs, more equipment.
I know we're in a bit of overtime, but we still have some questions coming in. If you all wouldn't mind, we can just get through these, or.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay.
Fine.
If you're exposed to a positive COVID test on day 4 through 6, should you still quarantine afterwards if it is negative?
Cheryl, what do you think?
Probably to be safe, I would, if you think there's a possibility. But you're saying if somebody had symptoms and they got tested, go ahead and get quarantined. But if the test comes back negative, then chances are you weren't exposed. I think it's circumstantial.
Yeah, that's how I would interpret it. Where do we get good numbers, good in quotes, with the CDC out of the loop?
I can take this to say there's been some controversy, obviously, about this. I will say so far, it looks like the new system is working consistently with the old system. So without getting into politics, it appears as if data is still coming through in the same way. And the CDC is not out of the loop, but they're not the first part of the loop. But that's all I know from public information.
That's what I've heard too.
Okay.
And can I add, there was a comment that was actually included with the license information, and they wanted to know what type of tests they were using at the White House, if anybody knows.
I do. They were using a test called Abbott ID Now. It's a point of care PCR test. It was, I think it's 22 minutes or something. It's a short turnaround time. It's an interesting test because it's a good example of, they submitted to the FDA with, I believe, I have to check this, 87% or, above 80 for sure, maybe even above 90. But in real world testing, people found it had a very high false negative rate. It's also a test that it has a high false negative rate for flu as well, but it's not clear because there've been a lot of different systems. But that's what they've publicly said they had at the White House. Cheryl, I don't know if you know more.
I haven't heard anything different from that, but that's kind of worrisome.
A few other questions here in the chat. With all of the questions regarding wearing face masks, are there any statistics showing their effectiveness?
Depends on the mask. They're finding like those scarves you put on, that are just plain cloth. Once they get wet, as osmosis makes the germs walk right through them. Some masks are better than others. Obviously, the N95s are the most effective. The one I heard recently that's not good is the one that looks like an N95, but it has a little filter, little thing on the side. That blows your contaminated breath right through that little opening, and they're absolutely not safe. They've been advertised as being nicer because you can get more fresh air, but they put out the saliva through that opening. So do not buy those.
I agree with Cheryl. There is, again, I think I can put a link in. There was an article today in Reuters that about do-it-yourself masks and how effective they are. The most important thing they said is make sure it's at least 2 layers, preferably 3 layers of fabric, and polyester on the outside, cotton on the inside. And that originally we were saying cotton, but actually cotton fibers have more space in between them than some polyester. And I'll try to put the link in the chat.
And wash them frequently. Don't wear one for 2 weeks.
Oh, good question, good point.
Yeah.
All right, I think you answered this question earlier. Are the test results statistics still going through CDC?
Yeah, I think I answered it. They're not,
Yep.
I think they're going, it's still working, I guess is the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. And the last question I see here, with states requiring 72-hour windows, how can the general public get their results in time?
Good luck.
What does that mean, 72-hour windows?
My
Lynn,
understanding is if you're traveling somewhere, you have to be tested within 3 days of going into that state. The saliva one at ASU maybe is the fastest, but you're saying it's not as accurate, so it's hard to know.
It's pretty accurate. I mean, let me say, Cheryl,
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't mean to say it wasn't.
Okay.
It's probably the best out there versus,
Right.
you know, ASU is a PCR test, and
Okay.
I have a huge amount of trust. I did not mean to say it wasn't accurate. I think some
Okay.
of these tests are not as accurate, but the ASU lab is one of the best labs around. But no
Good.
test is perfect.
Right.
and just to close it out from what I'm seeing here, Mara, I went ahead and published your link there to medscape.com.
Thanks.
And mentioning the ASU test, I know that you have to be an employee, staff, or student right now to get it, but ASU has partnered with the Arizona Department of Health Services, and they've been doing some community saliva-based testing. So you might check the Arizona Health Department website.
And that's all we have. Any parting words, presenters?
I
It's
would
an honor to speak to
personally-
Red Cross colleagues.
Diane, go ahead.
I would just like to really thank Mara and Cheryl for doing this, because we've had so many changes, such rapid fire changes in Red Cross, in our doctrine, and so much of what has happened with this virus has changed. And getting up-to-date statistics and information is so important, so that when we are providing care to our clients and our staff, we know what we're dealing with, we can answer questions, and we're educated about it. And I thought that this was a really good way to give people a different view of the COVID-19 disease that's out there and how we should be looking at it. So I really appreciate Mara and Cheryl for doing this.
It's our honor to present to our colleagues.
Thank you all
Same for
very
me.
much. This was really informative.
You're welcome.
Thank
All
you.
right.
And
Cheryl.
Go ahead, Diane.
I'm getting Yeah, I was just going to say I'm compiling the information for your CEs that have put it in here. My email, if you don't have your license number, you can always email it to me. And like I said, we'll get this out as quickly as we can.
Excellent. Well, I think that will conclude things for this late afternoon, early evening. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. Be sure to get your license information over to Diane or place it in the chat box. We'll keep this open for probably another 10 or 15 minutes. And really appreciate everybody's time. Thank you so much. This was very informative.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
And thank you all for putting up with the little delay in the slide changes.
Yeah.
We cannot let the machines win.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ian and Diane, for making this all come together.
Yes, we do appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad you guys could all participate.
All right, and that concludes our